can't imagine how quiet it gets in a small town until you've lived through a disappearance. You might think that the country's serene landscape, dotted with farms and winding roads, would be peaceful. But when you've lived in a place like this, you realize it can feel like you're just waiting for something to break the silence. It always does. It did back in 1996, when my brother Will disappeared. Will was a good kid, always curious, always full of life. My dad, Henry, was the kind of guy everyone trusted. He was a farmer, someone the town relied on. Everyone called him the steady hand because he was always there to lend a hand, whether it was harvesting crops or helping a neighbor fix their fence. People don't question the steady hand. And back then, no one questioned Will's disappearance either. He had just turned 19, and he was heading out to check on some cattle near the old Thompson farm. He'd done it 1,000 times. But that time, he didn't come home. Dad and I, along with the sheriff, drove the long roads, checking every inch of the fields, combing the forest, the creeks. Nothing. Will's truck was found a few miles from the farm, keys in the ignition, as if he'd just walked off into the fields. But there was no sign of him. It was like the earth had swallowed him whole. We didn't want to believe it. No one did. I guess that's part of the reason why the town moved on so quickly. They didn't want to think something like that could happen here, to someone like Will, to our family. But me, I never stopped asking questions. My brother was gone, and it didn't make sense. Years passed, and life in our small town rolled on. I married, had kids of my own, and tried to forget the hollow space Will's absence left. But for me, he was always there. His room stayed exactly the same, a shrine to the boy I once knew. It was in 2025 when things finally started to unravel. It started with a simple phone call, a call I never expected. Sheriff's Deputy Rob Adams, a guy I knew from high school, reached out to me. They'd reopened the investigation into Will's case. I don't know why, but something about this just doesn't sit right, Rob said. We found some new evidence we didn't have before. We're digging again. My heart skipped. It wasn't like it used to be. There was a weight in the air now, an air of suspicion that had never been there before. Rob mentioned DNA evidence, a breakthrough that had been overlooked back in the 90s. The investigation was starting again, this time with fresh eyes. I was skeptical, but Rob asked me to meet him at the sheriff's office to go over what they had. That night, he dropped a bombshell. We've uncovered something that could explain why your brother's case went cold for so long, he said. The man we believe is responsible for Will's disappearance. It's your father, Henry. I couldn't breathe. My dad, the steady hand, the man everyone trusted. You have to be kidding me, I muttered, shaking my head. My dad didn't have anything to do with Will's disappearance. There's no way. But Rob insisted, showing me a collection of newly discovered evidence, witness reports, a pattern of odd behavior from my father that had gone unnoticed for years. They had discovered that, long before Will disappeared, my father had been involved in violent incidents, ones he'd kept hidden under the veil of his respectable reputation. It wasn't just an isolated event. There were whispers in the past, incidents that no one connected at the time. Not until now. They found my father's name linked to the disappearance of another young man, a local who'd vanished in the early 1980s. The common thread. Henry had been there every time. The same twisted trail of violence, yet no one had ever connected the dots before. Even the people in town, who had looked up to my father, had never seen it coming. That's how well he hid it. But what hit me hardest was the story Rob told me about the night Will went missing. Apparently, my father had been acting strangely that evening, absent, aloof. Rob had gone through the old interviews again. My father had claimed he didn't know where Will was, but there had been no real search for him, no calls to the neighbors, nothing that suggested urgency. As I sat there, the weight of Rob's words sank in. My dad had to know something. He had to have had something to do with it. But why? What happened? What could have pushed a man like him to do something like that? And what about the rest of the family? Where did I fit into all of this? In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I thought I knew about my family had been a lie. I began digging into my father's past, something I had never really questioned. What I found both stunned and terrified me. I uncovered old records, files hidden away in the attic from years ago. I stumbled upon letters and documents that tied my father to a legacy of violence in our family, going back generations. It wasn't just my father, it was a pattern of abuse and secrecy that no one had ever talked about. A dark thread running through the men in our family, stretching all the way back to my great-grandfather. I was horrified. Had I been blind to this my whole life? Had I been so wrapped up in the illusion of a happy family that I never saw the truth? And if my father had done something to Will, what did that mean for the rest of us? I had to confront him. I remember the day I walked into the old farmhouse. Dad was sitting in his favorite chair, the chair that overlooked the fields he had worked his entire life. He looked up at me, and I could see the old man I remembered, but also something else, something darker. "Dad, what happened to Will?" I asked, my voice trembling. What really happened that day? He didn't answer immediately, just stared at me, his gaze piercing. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but cold. "You don't know what it's like to protect this family, Stephanie. There are things you don't understand, things I had to do to keep us safe." My stomach churned. "You killed him, didn't you?" Dad didn't flinch. He didn't have to. The silence said it all. "Why?" I whispered. "Why Will?" His lips curled into something like a sad smile. Sometimes the things you want most can't be kept. Sometimes it's just easier to make them go away. Tears welled up in my eyes. I couldn't believe it. The man I had once loved, the man who had raised me, had done the unthinkable. But the worst part wasn't just that he had murdered Will. It was that the town never suspected him. No one ever saw it coming. Not even me. In the days that followed, I came to a horrible realization. I was a part of a story I could never undo. The truth was too big, too ugly to ignore. My family wasn't just innocent victims of a crime. It was a family built on lies, on buried pain, on violence. In 2025, after nearly 30 years of waiting, the investigation was closed. My father's role in my brother's death was undeniable, but no one would ever really know what drove him to take his son's life. Was it rage, fear, or something more twisted? All I know is that my search for answers didn't just reveal the truth about my brother. It revealed a dark legacy that will haunt me for the rest of my life. And now, I have to live with the knowledge that my own flesh and blood were responsible for the disappearance of the boy I once knew. And as for my father, well, he's long gone now. But his story, it'll live on. The longest road home was one I'll never be able to escape from.